Welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight. As we settle in, we will drift back to the late 1990s, to the handheld glow of a Game Boy screen, where Pokémon Yellow offered a familiar journey. For many children, this was the first game in the series they played, and for others, it was a return to Kanto but shaped in new ways, reflecting the impact of the anime and the popularity of its mascot. Even decades later, this version carries secrets, adjustments, and design choices that make it stand apart. Let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from tonight and what other games you would like me to cover next. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss the next gentle exploration. One of the defining traits of Yellow was the way Pikachu was placed at the center of the adventure. Instead of choosing between 3 starters, every player began with this single companion, echoing the relationship shown in the animated series. This choice altered the rhythm of the journey immediately. Pikachu was not just a static sprite, but followed behind the player, its tiny form appearing on the overworld. This feature gave the sense of having a living partner rather than a mere menu entry. For many children, the sight of that yellow figure trailing behind their trainer was magical, a small shift that carried enormous emotional weight. This following mechanic was paired with a happiness system, one of the earliest attempts to tie emotion to gameplay. By checking on Pikachu, players could see how it felt, conveyed through changing expressions. If treated kindly, it smiled and hopped with joy. If neglected or fainted in battle, it sulked or frowned. This mechanic was primitive by modern standards, but it represented a major step toward connecting players with their partners. It was one of the first times the series suggested that creatures had personalities beyond their stats. The game drew heavily from the anime's influence, weaving familiar characters into its structure. Jesse and James, the bumbling members of Team Rocket, appeared as antagonists, giving the adventure a layer of humor and recognition. Their inclusion was more than fan service. It demonstrated how quickly the franchise had become multimedia, with the games and the show shaping each other. For players who had watched the anime on television, encountering these villains in pixel form was a thrilling confirmation that both worlds were linked. Another change was the redesign of many sprites. Compared to the blocky proportions of red and blue, Yellow refined the artwork to more closely resemble official illustrations. This was most noticeable in the way iconic creatures such as Charizard or Blastoise were drawn. Instead of distorted or exaggerated features, their sprites carried smoother outlines and proportions that matched their promotional art. This gave Yellow an identity as a visual upgrade, a step toward the polish that later generations would take for granted. The starter situation created another unique feature. Because Pikachu was locked as the player's partner, the 3 original starters were instead obtainable throughout the journey. Charmander, Bulbasaur, and Squirtle were gifted by NPCs, reflecting the generosity of the anime storyline, where Ash gradually collected all 3. This change was significant because it allowed players to complete the trio without trading, something that had been impossible in red and blue without a second cartridge. For children without access to link cables, this was a revelation, finally giving them the chance to train all 3 on a single adventure. Difficulty balancing was also adjusted in subtle ways. Gym leaders carried slightly different rosters, designed to reflect the anime. Brock's team was made easier to handle with Pikachu by lowering levels, while later leaders sometimes carried creatures closer to what viewers recognized from television. These shifts created a sense of familiarity, while also making the game more approachable for younger players who had been drawn in by the show. It was a careful balance between faithfulness to the original games and accessibility to new fans. The Surfing Pikachu minigame added another layer of charm. If players connected with certain promotional events or used special transfers, their Pikachu could learn Surf, unlocking a small side activity where it rode waves on a surfboard. The sight of the mascot gliding across the water became one of the most iconic Easter eggs of its era. Though limited in scope, it represented one of the earliest instances of Pokémon engaging with minigames beyond battling. It hinted at the creative directions the series could expand into long before contests, Pokeathlon, or other diversions appeared in later generations. Yellow also emphasized cuteness and personality in ways its predecessors had not. Dialogue from NPCs occasionally referenced the uniqueness of the Pikachu companion, reinforcing the idea that it was more than just another team member. Even small flourishes, like hearing its cry in digitized form rather than a generic sound effect, reinforced this bond. While technology was limited, the game made every effort to push against those limits, creating moments where imagination and programming met in playful harmony. The cultural impact of Yellow was enormous. Released after Red and Blue had already sparked a craze, it capitalized on the success of the anime to draw in new fans. Its timing ensured that children who had discovered Pokémon through television now had a game that matched what they saw on screen. This cross-pollination between media was a masterstroke, solidifying the franchise as a cultural juggernaut. For many, Yellow was not just a game, but the gateway into a larger world of cards, toys, movies, and shared childhood experiences. Even the packaging reflected this identity. The box art, featuring a determined Pikachu ready for battle, symbolized the mascot's new role as the face of the franchise. It stood apart from the dragon and turtle of earlier covers, signaling a shift from creatures of raw power to one of charm and recognition. This visual change echoed the broader message of Yellow. Pokémon was not only about strength, but about connection, personality, and storytelling. Looking back, Yellow represents an era where experimentation and adaptation defined the series. It did not simply rehash Red and Blue, but reshape them through the lens of the anime and the appeal of its mascot. Its features, from a following companion to refined sprites and altered rosters, made the world feel alive in new ways. For children falling asleep to the gentle glow of their Game Boy, Yellow was not just a game, it was a companion itself, guiding them through forests, caves, and cities with the loyalty of a small electric mouse always by their side. In Red and Blue, starters became strong partners, but they remained part of a larger collection. In Yellow, Pikachu was inseparable, visible not only in battle but in the overworld, following step by step across grassy routes, busy cities, and dark caves. For the first time, the concept of a bond was translated directly into the gameplay itself. This following mechanic might appear simple, but it marked a leap in immersion. The small sprite, trailing behind the trainer, created the illusion of companionship, as though the adventure was being shared rather than played alone. It was one of the earliest examples of visual storytelling within the series, because every player, no matter how they approached the game, carried with them this constant reminder of connection. Children who had watched Ash travel with Pikachu on the anime found themselves mirrored in their own handheld journey, bridging two mediums through design. The refusal mechanic added tension as well. While rare, a sulky Pikachu that refused to enter battle drove home the idea that relationships could not be taken for granted. It was not enough to collect, one had to nurture. This gentle lesson aligned with the themes of the anime, where Ash often struggled to earn Pikachu's trust in the early episodes. Yellow mirrored this narrative within gameplay, turning fiction into mechanics that every player experienced firsthand. Unlike later titles, where multiple Pokémon could express affection, Yellow focused solely on this one companion. This exclusivity heightened its importance. There were no comparisons to be made, no balancing of multiple bonds. The entire mechanic revolved around the single idea that the mascot itself was special. This was a bold statement by the developers, one that placed personality at the center of design rather than raw variety. The choice to focus on Pikachu also reshaped the competitive experience of Yellow. Without access to the traditional starter trio at the beginning, early battles were more challenging. Facing Brock's rock types with an electric companion that could not damage them effectively became a defining trial. Many players resorted to catching Nidoran or training Butterfree with confusion to overcome this hurdle. This forced creativity in team building and ensured that no two journeys were exactly the same. What might have been a design flaw became a legendary challenge, remembered fondly by those who struggled through it. Balancing this challenge was the gift of the other starters later in the game. The bond with Pikachu was established first, and the trio followed later, echoing the anime where Ash gradually collected them. This change in pacing altered the sense of progression, ensuring that the mascot remained central while still honoring the tradition of raising all three. The unique mechanics of Pikachu even extended into external features. Special promotional distributions allowed this companion to learn Surf, unlocking a whimsical minigame where it rode waves on a surfboard. For those who managed to obtain this version, the sight of Pikachu gliding across the ocean was unforgettable. It was one of the earliest examples of a Pokémon being given an identity beyond its standard role, a playful side activity that emphasized fun as much as strategy. The minigame's simple graphics and looping animations carried charm that transcended technical limitations, becoming a memory as iconic as any battle. The decision to integrate Pikachu so thoroughly was more than design, it was marketing genius. By aligning the game with the anime's most recognizable figure, the developers ensured instant recognition. Children who had never touched a Game Boy but watched the show were suddenly given a chance to step into the same shoes as the protagonist they admired. It blurred the line between fan and participant, embedding loyalty to the franchise through shared experiences across mediums. From a development standpoint, Pikachu's following feature was technically complex for its time. It required constant sprite management, updated animations, and adjustments to map navigation. Yet these challenges were embraced precisely because they elevated the game beyond a simple re-release. The developers knew that innovation did not have to come in massive leaps. Sometimes a small addition could transform the entire feel of an adventure. The emphasis on happiness also hinted at the philosophical direction the franchise would take. The core message of Pokémon has always been about friendship, cooperation, and care. By tying these themes directly into mechanics, Yellow became a crystallization of the franchise's identity. It showed that Pokémon were not just tools for victory, but companions whose well-being mattered. For players drifting into sleep with their Game Boy beside them, the gentle reminder was clear. Kindness, patience, and attention could make bonds stronger, both in games and in life. The unique place of Pikachu in Yellow cannot be overstated. It was the heart of the journey, the spark of innovation, and the bridge between game and anime. More than 2 decades later, players still remember the joy of checking its mood, the frustration of its refusal, and the comfort of its constant presence. In a series filled with hundreds of creatures and countless regions, this one bond stands apart as the purest embodiment of what Pokémon was meant to be. One of the most distinctive qualities of Pokémon Yellow was the way it absorbed elements from the anime and wove them into its structure. While Red and Blue had established Kanto as a place of adventure and strategy, Yellow reimagined it through the lens of the television series that had swept the world. For children who tuned in weekly to watch Ash travel with Pikachu, battling gym leaders, and facing the antics of Team Rocket, Yellow was not just a game, but an extension of the stories they already loved. Perhaps the most iconic example of this influence was the inclusion of Jesse and James. In Red and Blue, the antagonists of Team Rocket were faceless grunts, serving as obstacles with little personality. In Yellow, these two recurring figures appeared throughout the journey, mirroring their roles in the anime. Their exaggerated schemes and humorous failures gave the game a layer of character absent from the original versions. Each encounter with them felt less like a random battle and more like a chapter in a continuing story, adding continuity to the adventure. Their Pokemon lineups were drawn directly from the show, further reinforcing the connection. Ekans and Coughing, later evolving into Arbok and Wheezing, became recurring opponents. Meowth, though unable to speak in-game, appeared alongside them, strengthening the illusion that the world of the anime and the game were one and the same. These battles were not especially difficult, but their narrative significance made them memorable. They represented the first time the series had leaned so heavily into transmedia storytelling, creating consistency across mediums in a way that resonated deeply with fans. Gym leaders, too, reflected this shift. Their teams were altered to better mirror the creatures they were known for in the anime. Brock's roster was adjusted to be less punishing for players, starting with Pikachu, while Misty's lineup more closely echoed her role as a water-type specialist familiar to viewers. These changes were subtle but meaningful, especially for children who had memorized the characters' traits from television. To face them in-game felt like meeting them again, this time with the opportunity to step into Ash's shoes. Dialogue throughout the game was also influenced by the anime. Characters occasionally referenced Pikachu's uniqueness, reinforcing its identity as the mascot rather than just another electric type. The rival, though not named Ash or Gary, carried personality traits closer to the brash rivals seen on television. Even small encounters were touched by this influence, as if the developers wanted every part of the game to echo what children already knew from watching. The anime's impact extended beyond characters to structure. The decision to grant players the 3 original starters as gifts echoed Ash's journey, where he gradually collected Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle through acts of kindness. These gifts in Yellow felt like narrative rewards rather than gameplay necessities, mirroring the way Ash built his team not through catching, but through forming bonds. This shift highlighted the theme of friendship, reinforcing the message that Pokémon was about connection as much as competition. Even the pacing of the game seemed to nod toward the anime. Encounters with Jesse and James created narrative beats, almost like episodes within the broader arc. Their presence broke up the standard rhythm of battling grunts and challenging leaders, giving the adventure more personality. For players used to the straightforward climb of Red and Blue, this injection of humor and story gave Yellow a unique flavor, one that stood apart not only from its predecessors, but from many of its successors as well. Visual design changes further emphasized the anime connection. Sprites were refined to more closely resemble the official artwork used in promotional material, which itself aligned with the show's designs. Characters looked cleaner, more recognizable, and less abstract than in earlier games. These improvements, while technical, also carried cultural significance. They tied the handheld adventure to the broader media empire, ensuring consistency in how the world of Pokémon was imagined across television, merchandise, and games. The decision to center Pikachu as the mascot also stemmed from the anime's popularity. While the character had appeared in Red and Blue as just another entry in the Pokédex, the television series elevated it into a global icon. Yellow reflected this transformation, placing Pikachu at the forefront of gameplay and marketing alike. For many children, the yellow box art featuring Pikachu ready for battle was the first time they truly saw the mascot positioned as the face of the franchise. It was a visual signal that the game and show were now inseparable. The anime influence even reached into the soundtrack. While much of the music remained faithful to the Kanto themes, subtle adjustments created tones more aligned with the energy of the show. Battle themes carried sharper rhythms, and Pikachu's digitized cry, distinct from the generic calls of other Pokémon, reinforced the sense that this was a living character rather than a static sprite. These details created a stronger emotional connection for players, who often heard those same cries echoing in the anime episodes they watched. The presence of Jesse and James also shifted the tone of villainy in Yellow. Team Rocket was no longer an anonymous organization, but one with familiar faces that brought levity to otherwise serious conflicts. This balance of humor and threat reflected the franchise's broader identity, blending danger with charm to keep the experience accessible to children. Their repeated failures, though predictable, became a source of comfort, a rhythm that reassured players even as they advanced deeper into Kanto. In hindsight, the integration of anime elements into Yellow was a bold experiment. It demonstrated that the Pokémon franchise was not confined to a single medium but could thrive across multiple forms of storytelling. By blending game mechanics with television narratives, Yellow became a hybrid experience, one that both reflected and shaped the way players understood the franchise. It taught developers and fans alike that Pokémon was not just a game or a show, but a universe, one that could expand and adapt endlessly. For children drifting into sleep with their Game Boy beside them, this merging of worlds was seamless. They could watch Ash battle on television in the afternoon, then step into a parallel adventure in the evening, guided by the same characters and creatures. The consistency of experience across mediums created a sense of immersion unmatched by most games of the era. It was not simply play, it was participation in a phenomenon that felt alive, shared, and global. Pokémon Yellow stood out not only because of its anime connections, but also because of how it polished the visual presentation of Kanto. When players held their Game Boy up to the light and turned it on, they immediately noticed that this was not the same world they had seen in Red and Blue. Sprites had been redrawn, maps refined, and details adjusted to create an adventure that felt more alive and more consistent with the growing identity of the franchise. These graphical improvements gave Yellow its own flavor, ensuring it was more than just a retelling with a mascot at the center. The redesign of Pokémon sprites was one of the most visible changes. In Red and Blue, many creatures were drawn with odd proportions due to technical limitations and the inexperience of the design team. Some had oversized heads, awkward stances, or shapes that only loosely resembled their official artwork. Yellow corrected these issues, smoothing outlines and redrawing figures to better match the illustrations that appeared in guidebooks, trading cards, and promotional material. This adjustment carried more weight than simple polish. It unified the visual language of the franchise, making the creatures recognizable across media. For example, the fearsome dragon-like form of Charizard looked sleeker in yellow, closer to how children imagined it from cards and posters. The shell details of Blastoise were sharpened, and the leafy crown of Venusaur gained depth. Even smaller or less celebrated Pokémon benefited from these revisions. Odd distortions present in earlier versions were replaced with cleaner shapes, creating a world that felt more cohesive. These changes signaled a new attention to brand consistency, an important step as Pokémon shifted from niche RPG to global icon. Trainer sprites also saw improvements. Gym leaders appeared with more confident poses, their designs reflecting personalities more clearly than before. Brock stood with a strong stance that suggested stability. Misty carried the energy of her role as a water-type specialist, and Erica's sprite exuded calmness, fitting for a grass-type user. Even generic trainers such as bug catchers and fishermen looked sharper, with designs that gave a little more character to encounters that might otherwise blur together. These visual flourishes added depth to the world, turning battles into interactions with personalities rather than faceless obstacles. Maps themselves gained subtle adjustments. Grass patches were reshaped for smoother flow, cave entrances placed with more care, and small graphical details improved readability, while the overall layout of Kanto remained faithful to the originals. These refinements created a sense of polish that made exploration less clunky. Paths were clearer, interiors tidier, and sprites more consistent. These adjustments reflected the lessons the developers had learned since the release of Red and Blue, proof that the franchise was already evolving within its own generation. Pikachu's overworld sprite deserves particular attention. Unlike static menu icons, this small figure followed the player faithfully, bouncing with joy when content and sulking when upset. It was not just a design choice, but a technical achievement, requiring constant sprite management without overwhelming the Game Boy's limited memory. Its distinct shape made it instantly recognizable, reinforcing the mascot's role as the centerpiece of the adventure. This little sprite carried enormous cultural weight, becoming one of the most enduring memories of the game. Yellow also experimented with visual personality in ways no prior entry had attempted. By tying Pikachu's sprite expressions to happiness, the developers gave players direct feedback through graphics rather than numbers. A smiling sprite carried more emotional impact than a stat increase ever could. This decision hinted at the future of the series, where personality and connection would become just as important as battle mechanics. It was one of the earliest examples of graphics being used not only for representation, but for storytelling. Even the battle interface felt refined. Health bars, menus, and backgrounds were adjusted to be smoother and clearer. While still simple by modern standards, these improvements mattered to players navigating countless battles. Clarity translated into immersion, reducing friction and allowing players to focus on the creatures themselves. For children playing late into the night, these small adjustments helped make the world feel accessible and engaging, even as the glow of the Game Boy dimmed. Some Pokémon gained entirely new poses in their redesigned sprites, often reflecting traits highlighted in the anime or official art. Pikachu itself appeared more upright and expressive, standing as a character rather than a simple battle model. Jigglypuff gained rounded proportions that matched its appearance on television, and Meowth's sprite carried more personality than its red and blue counterpart. These changes reinforced the sense that Yellow was not only a refinement, but a deliberate effort to align the games with the broader franchise. The impact of these visual adjustments extended beyond the screen. Children who played Yellow often compared the new sprites to the older ones in trading cards, stickers, or strategy guides. Discussions about which versions looked better became part of the playground culture surrounding the series. In this way, Yellow did more than improve graphics. It shaped how fans talked about the franchise, embedding sprite design into the shared conversation of Pokémon fandom. Yellow also foreshadowed the direction that handheld gaming would take. By demonstrating how much a game could be improved through sprite work alone, it set the stage for later special editions and remakes. It proved that refinement could carry as much weight as innovation, and that reimagining familiar content with better presentation could feel like a fresh experience. This lesson influenced not only Pokémon, but other franchises, inspiring developers to think about how to revisit existing games with polish and care. The graphical polish of Yellow also reinforced the emotional tone of the adventure. Walking through forests felt more lush, caves more ominous, and towns more inviting. Even with limited hardware, these changes deepened immersion, proving that artistry was not bound by technology, but by imagination. For players drifting into sleep with their Game Boy balanced on a pillow, the world of Yellow shimmered just a little brighter, glowing with the polish of a game that understood the power of presentation. Pokémon Yellow was never meant to be just a retelling of the Kanto journey. It carried with it small secrets, playful experiments, and hidden features that gave the game an identity separate from its predecessors. For many children in the late 1990s, these little discoveries became some of the most talked about moments on playgrounds and in magazines. They were the sparks of wonder that turned the familiar world of red and blue into something that shimmered with surprises. One of the most legendary additions was Surfing Pikachu. This feature could only be unlocked under specific circumstances, such as transferring a special Pikachu from events or using certain distribution cartridges. When activated, it taught Pikachu the move Surf, which was already a novelty. But the true magic came from the minigame it unlocked. On the beaches of the game, players could access a simple but delightful sequence where Pikachu rode a surfboard across rolling waves. The sprite animation was playful, capturing balance, motion, and even personality within the limited Game Boy graphics. For those lucky enough to see it, the Surfing Pikachu event was unforgettable, an Easter egg that felt like a gift from the developers to their most dedicated fans. This surfing feature symbolized something larger. It represented one of the earliest times the series experimented with side activities beyond battles and catching. Long before contests, Pokethlon or Ami, Surfing Pikachu was a glimpse of the creative directions the franchise could take. It suggested that Pokémon could exist in worlds beyond the battlefield, participating in sports, games, and playful diversions. For children who stumbled upon it, it felt like magic hidden within the cartridge, a moment when the game stepped outside its own rules to surprise and delight. Event distributions in Yellow also carried significance. During its lifespan, special Pokémon such as Mew were available at promotional events, requiring players to bring their cartridges to real-world locations. For many, this was their first encounter with the concept of events, where gameplay stretched beyond the boundaries of the cartridge and into social gatherings. These distributions reinforced the sense that Pokémon was not just a game, but a community phenomenon, shared in lines at malls, conventions, and even through schoolyard rumors. Yellow also experimented with how certain Pokémon could be obtained. Instead of locking the original starters behind trading, it gave them out as gifts along the journey. This decision not only mirrored Ash's storyline, but also changed how children experienced completion. For the first time, it was possible to build a team that included all three without relying on friends or cables. This small generosity meant that Yellow could be enjoyed fully by children playing alone, broadening its accessibility while still maintaining the spirit of discovery. The availability of unique in-game trades and adjustments to encounter rates further distinguished Yellow. Certain Pokémon appeared in different areas or at different levels compared to Red and Blue, creating a sense of novelty for veterans. These differences encouraged exploration, as even familiar routes carried surprises. For completionists, the thrill of discovering these shifts made the world feel both nostalgic and new. Even the Pokédex itself carried tweaks. Descriptions in Yellow sometimes differed from earlier versions, offering small lore changes that fascinated attentive players. These adjustments hinted at a broader mythology, encouraging speculation and deepening the sense that the world of Pokémon was layered with mysteries. Though the changes were minor in text, they sparked big discussions, showing how even small words could shape perception. Yellow also included tiny flourishes that became iconic memories. Pikachu's digitized cry, distinct from the generic sounds of other Pokémon, felt like a personal touch from the developers. For children who had heard that cry on television, its inclusion in-game created a seamless link between mediums. It was a sound that defined the game, carrying personality and familiarity in a way no other companion could replicate. Hidden features and glitches added another layer of fascination. While not as famous as the missing no glitch of Red and Blue, Yellow still carried its share of quirks. Rumors of hidden events, secret evolutions, or ways to obtain rare Pokémon through unusual steps spread like wildfire among players. Whether true or not, these rumors became part of the culture surrounding the game. Children swapped stories about what could be unlocked if you treated Pikachu in specific ways or completed battles under strange conditions. Even when untrue, these myths added depth, transforming the game into a playground of possibilities. Promotional tie-ins also defined Yellow's uniqueness. It was one of the first games to align so directly with marketing campaigns, ensuring that every element of the franchise pointed back to Pikachu as the mascot. Commercials emphasized its following feature, posters showcased its overworld sprite, and events highlighted its special abilities. This synergy cemented Pikachu's role as the face of the franchise, ensuring that even casual fans recognized it instantly. Yellow's exclusives also reflected the developers' willingness to experiment. The inclusion of Surfing Pikachu, altered rosters, and sprite refinements demonstrated that they were not content to simply repackage the original games. Instead, they saw Yellow as an opportunity to test ideas that might influence the future. Many of these features, though small, laid the groundwork for systems that would become standard in later generations. Happiness, personality, and side activities all found their roots in these experiments. For players, these exclusives became memories that lasted long after the batteries in their cartridges faded. They remembered the thrill of discovering a slightly different sprite, the joy of obtaining all three starters, or the wonder of unlocking Surfing Pikachu. These moments defined Yellow not as just another version, but as a special chapter in the story of the franchise. It shimmered with surprises, each one a reminder that even familiar worlds could hold new secrets. Looking back, these hidden features and exclusive events embody what made Yellow magical. It was not just about re-experiencing Kanto, but about discovering new layers within it. It encouraged curiosity, rewarded patience, and whispered that surprises were always waiting just around the corner. For children drifting into dreams with their Game Boy nearby, These secrets became stories retold countless times, memories that sparkled like treasures found in the quiet corners of a world they thought they already knew. Pokemon Yellow may have been built on the foundation of Red and Blue, but it quickly proved itself to be more than a simple reissue. Beneath the surface, countless adjustments to maps, rosters, and encounters gave the game its own rhythm. For children who thought they knew Kanto by heart, these changes kept exploration fresh, ensuring that every step carried the possibility of something unexpected. One of the most striking differences came in gym leader rosters. In Red and Blue, these trainers followed straightforward patterns, each specializing in their type. In Yellow, their teams were redesigned to reflect their anime counterparts more closely. Brock, whose rock types had once formed a wall for new trainers, carried lower-level Pokemon that made him more approachable for players, beginning with Pikachu. Misty's team leaned harder into her aquatic identity, providing a recognizable lineup to children familiar with her role in the anime. Erika's roster reflected her calm and graceful image, while Koga's poisonous lineup carried a stronger thematic identity. Even Giovanni's team leaned into the persona of a true villain, more in line with his role in the show. These adjustments gave battles more flavor, turning gym leaders into characters rather than simple obstacles. The rival also underwent changes. In Red and Blue, he progressed through the journey with a predictable pattern, always one step ahead. In Yellow, his team was adjusted to include creatures associated with Gary from the anime. This meant facing new lineups that sometimes caught players by surprise, adding tension to rival battles. His personality also carried sharper edges, reflecting his arrogance and competitiveness from television. For players who watched Ash and Gary clash weekly, these encounters felt like direct extensions of the show. Maps themselves saw subtle but important refinements. Certain areas had their layouts altered for smoother navigation. Grass patches were shifted, item placements adjusted, and trainers reorganized to create a better flow. The Safari Zone carried small tweaks that made encounters feel fresher, and caves, such as Mount Moon and Rock Tunnel, were adjusted to balance challenge with accessibility. While the broad strokes of Kanto remained intact, these small refinements gave veterans reasons to slow down and notice the details. Wild encounters also changed in Yellow, altering the availability of certain Pokemon compared to Red and Blue. This meant that some species appeared earlier or later, encouraging players to experiment with new teams. For example, the inclusion of creatures that reflected anime episodes made routes feel tied to the stories fans knew from television. The effect was subtle but powerful. Even a familiar patch of tall grass could feel different when the potential discoveries inside had shifted. The availability of the 3 original starters fundamentally changed progression. Instead of choosing just one, players could collect all 3 through NPC gifts, echoing Ash's journey. This altered not only team composition, but also pacing. A player might find themselves rotating between 4 companions early in the game, rather than relying on a single powerhouse. This diversification created a different experience of Kanto, one that felt more balanced and connected to the broader franchise narrative. Even Team Rocket's presence altered the structure of the game. Jesse and James appeared at multiple points, turning otherwise routine dungeons into story-driven events. Their repeated attempts to block progress gave dungeons a sense of continuity, as if the villains themselves were chasing the player across the map. This change kept the journey engaging, transforming what might have been simple battles into narrative moments that children eagerly anticipated. Trainer battles across the region also carried small but meaningful refinements. Levels were adjusted, movesets tweaked, and lineups expanded to better balance difficulty. These changes reflected lessons learned from the first generation's early design. Where red and blue sometimes presented sudden spikes or odd pacing, yellow smoothed the curve, ensuring a steadier rhythm of challenge. For players, this translated into a more natural flow that felt less punishing but still rewarding. Even towns carried refinements. Dialogue was reworked to reference Pikachu, the anime, and the changes unique to Yellow. NPCs sometimes commented on the player's unusual companion, reinforcing its central role. These touches gave the world more personality, as if the towns themselves acknowledged the uniqueness of this adventure. For children who had dreamed of living in Ash's world, these lines confirmed that they were walking through the same story. Certain iconic battles carried more dramatic changes. Lieutenant Surge's electric types leaned into his reputation from the show, while Sabrina's psychic lineup was tweaked to emphasize her eerie dominance. Blaine's fiery team became even more thematic, reflecting his personality more sharply. These changes may not have drastically altered difficulty, but they deepened immersion, making each leader feel more like a distinct character. The Elite Four, too, carried adjustments that gave the finale of the game more weight. Their lineups reflected stronger thematic cohesion, and their levels were balanced to create a steady escalation of difficulty. Facing them in yellow felt less like a repeat of red and blue, and more like the culmination of a unique journey. This sense of distinction mattered, for it reinforced the idea that Yellow was not simply an alternate version, but its own story. One of the most fascinating aspects of these differences is how they reflected the developers' growing understanding of pacing and narrative. With Yellow, they were not simply building a game but crafting an experience that blended mechanics, anime influence, and refinement. Every adjustment, from gym leader rosters to wild encounter tables, carried the message that this was a polished retelling of Kanto through a new lens. For players, these changes gave the world longevity. Even if they had memorized the roots of red and blue, Yellow offered surprises at every turn. Trainers who expected to breeze through familiar areas found themselves pausing to reconsider strategies. Children who recognized teams from the anime felt the thrill of connection. Veterans who thought they knew every corner of Kanto discovered new rhythms. Looking back, these differences are what gave Yellow its lasting charm. It was not just about Pikachu following the player, but about the way every system, every map, and every roster had been reconsidered. It was a game designed to feel both familiar and fresh, comforting and surprising. For players lying awake with the Game Boy glowing softly in their hands, these changes created a world worth revisiting again and again, proof that even small refinements could transform a well-known journey into something new. One of the most charming details about Pokémon Yellow lies in its music. While much of the soundtrack carried over from Red and Blue, subtle adjustments were made to create a sense of freshness. The battle themes, route music, and town melodies were familiar enough to spark nostalgia, but carried slightly altered arrangements that sharpened their impact on the Game Boy's limited sound channels. Pikachu's voice itself represented a groundbreaking leap in sound design for the franchise. In Red and Blue, cries were abstract bursts of tone, distorted by the limitations of the hardware. Yellow introduced digitized samples of Ikue Otani's performance, capturing the warmth and personality of the anime mascot. For many children, hearing a recognizable pika or Pikachu through their handheld speaker was astonishing. This single detail bridged the gap between the television series and the game, pulling the two mediums together in a way no one had anticipated. While it required sacrificing memory space that could have been used for other features, the decision proved invaluable. It gave Yellow a charm that elevated it far beyond a simple special edition. Dialogue across the game also carried new touches. NPCs referenced Pikachu, the presence of Jesse and James, and events tied more closely to the anime. This weaving of show and game made the world feel more alive. For instance, shopkeepers might comment on the unusual sight of a trainer traveling with a free-roaming Pikachu, or Team Rocket grunts would speak lines that matched their bumbling personalities from television. These additions turned ordinary text boxes into connections with a broader world, strengthening immersion for players who recognized the references. Localization provided its own quirks. In Japan, certain lines carried cultural references that were adapted for Western audiences. One small but telling example lies in the way Pokémon names were reworked to better suit English speakers, ensuring they carried charm, humor, or thematic resonance. Yellow, being released after the anime had already achieved popularity abroad, leaned even more heavily on consistency between mediums. Moves, items, and dialogue were aligned with the terms children already knew from watching Saturday morning cartoons. This consistency reinforced immersion, preventing the dissonance that sometimes crept into earlier translations. Interestingly, some localization quirks from Red and Blue carried forward into Yellow, becoming accidental traditions. The move Splash, famously mistranslated from the Japanese hop, remained unchanged, even though it confused players who expected it to relate to water. This oddity became part of the franchise's personality, embraced as a beloved inconsistency. Similarly, item descriptions occasionally retained stiff or unusual phrasing, reflecting the limited space available on screen. These quirks may have been unintentional, but they contributed to the charm of early generations, giving them a distinctive tone that fans remember fondly. The incorporation of anime-inspired dialogue also highlighted the growing global nature of Pokémon. Yellow represented one of the first times that a game so directly aligned itself with its animated counterpart, a decision that acknowledged the power of cross-media storytelling. For international audiences, this was a clear signal that Pokémon was no longer just a niche handheld RPG, but a worldwide phenomenon spanning games, television, movies, and cards. Dialogue shifts in Yellow reflected this ambition, grounding the game in the larger identity of the franchise. Another fascinating detail lies in the ways dialogue served as subtle tutorials. Where Red and Blue sometimes left mechanics unexplained, Yellow inserted clearer hints. NPCs provided more guidance about type matchups, moves, and the importance of status effects. This shift reflected Game Freak's awareness that new players, many introduced to Pokémon through the anime, would be approaching the series for the first time with Yellow. By embedding these lessons into natural dialogue, the developers softened the learning curve without breaking immersion. Even humor found its way into the script. Certain NPCs were given quirkier lines that mirrored the lighthearted tone of the show. Team Rocket, in particular, embodied this approach. Their lines were often silly, melodramatic, or exaggerated, making their appearances memorable. While their bumbling villainy posed little real danger, their dialogue injected levity into dungeons that might otherwise have felt repetitive. For children, these moments were delightful, turning enemy encounters into comedic highlights. The balance between humor and seriousness extended across the region. Dialogue in Lavender Town, for example, retained its somber tone, reminding players of the darker themes beneath the surface of Pokemon's world. This contrast reinforced the emotional range of the game. One moment, a trainer might laugh at Team Rocket's antics, and the next, they would feel the quiet unease of a haunted tower. Yellow's script managed to blend these tones gracefully, ensuring that the journey felt both whimsical and meaningful. Yellow also introduced more references to the player's bond with Pikachu. NPCs occasionally remarked on the visible friendship, hinting at the hidden affection mechanic that determined whether Pikachu would display happiness or frustration. This mechanic, though simple, carried emotional weight. By tying dialogue to Pikachu's moods, the game encouraged players to care about their companion in a way that transcended stats or battles. For children, this connection mirrored Ash's relationship with Pikachu in the anime, reinforcing the sense that they were living out the same story. The presence of these dialogue shifts also highlights how text served as a form of environmental storytelling. While the maps of Kanto were largely unchanged, the words that filled them gave new context. Towns felt slightly different when NPCs acknowledged anime-inspired events. Dungeons felt more alive when villains cracked jokes or expressed exaggerated frustration. Even small lines, like a passerby commenting on Pikachu's unusual behavior, reinforced the central theme that this was not a standard journey, but one shaped by the player's unique companion. The localization of humor sometimes required creative choices. Jokes that relied on Japanese wordplay were replaced with English puns, ensuring that the spirit of the humor carried across language barriers. This approach gave Yellow its own comedic voice, distinct from Red and Blue. In some cases, these changes became so iconic that players assumed they were part of the original script. This blending of localization and design illustrates how translations can shape the identity of a game as much as its mechanics or visuals. It is worth noting how the presence of Pikachu's vocalizations altered player perception. For many children, the familiar cry gave the impression that the game was more technologically advanced than it really was. In truth, it was a clever use of limited audio samples, strategically placed to maximize impact. Yet the illusion mattered more than the reality. Players felt that their companion was alive in ways that no text box could have conveyed. This innovation demonstrated the developer's ability to use sound design as a storytelling tool, bridging the gap between imagination and technology. Beyond sound and text, the overall presentation of Yellow reflected a more polished vision of Kanto. Menus carried minor refinements, item descriptions were cleaned up, and even the pacing of dialogue boxes felt smoother. These small details may seem trivial, but they contributed to the sense that Yellow was a carefully crafted retelling rather than a rushed tie-in. The effort to refine presentation reflected the developer's recognition that Pokémon was now a global brand with high expectations. The combination of soundtrack adjustments, digitized cries, dialogue tweaks, and localization quirks all served a common purpose: to make Yellow feel distinct. While the maps and mechanics were rooted in familiar soil, these presentation changes gave the journey new texture. They reminded players that even the smallest details could transform a well-worn path into a fresh adventure. Looking back, these shifts reveal how deeply the developers understood their audience. They recognized that children connected not only with mechanics, but with voices, jokes, and personalities. By aligning Yellow more closely with the anime, They ensured that players felt immersed in the broader world of Pokémon, blurring the lines between game and show. The result was a game that felt alive, playful, and meaningful in ways its predecessors had only hinted at. One of the defining qualities of Pokémon Yellow was the way it translated story beats from the anime into the structure of the game. The most famous example was the inclusion of Jesse and James, who replaced ordinary Team Rocket grunts in certain battles. Instead of being generic obstacles, they became recurring personalities, popping up in Mount Moon, the Rocket Hideout, Pokemon Tower, and Silphco. Each encounter mirrored the playful, bumbling tone of their television counterparts, complete with exaggerated team lineups that included Ekans, Coughing, and Meowth. While the duo posed little actual challenge, their presence made dungeons more memorable, giving each confrontation a sense of character and continuity. Players were no longer fighting faceless criminals, but familiar villains with flair, which added charm to otherwise routine battles. This blending of anime and game extended to Pikachu's role as well. In Yellow, Pikachu refused to evolve, echoing the anime's emphasis on individuality and bonds over raw power. In mechanical terms, this meant players had to progress through the entire region with a companion that, while lovable, lacked the competitive edge of Raichu. Yet this restriction turned into a feature rather than a flaw. It symbolized the deeper theme of loyalty, reminding players that strength was not the only path to victory. For many children, keeping Pikachu unevolved created a sense of shared journey, one that mirrored Ash's struggles and triumphs. Even the structure of rival battles shifted in Yellow. Instead of following the exact pattern from Red and Blue, the rivals' team was adjusted to better reflect anime influences. The first battle was designed to be more challenging, with the rivals' starter lineup tailored to exploit the player's Pikachu. Later fights incorporated species that aligned more with the anime's narrative beats, reinforcing the idea that this was not a strict retelling of the original story, but a reimagined journey that sat between television and game. These differences forced players to adjust their strategies, ensuring that even those familiar with Red and Blue encountered surprises along the way. Map changes also reflected anime influences. For example, certain areas were adjusted to feature Pokémon more prominently associated with key episodes. Encounters in Viridian Forest had a higher likelihood of producing Caterpie, Weedle, and their evolutions, echoing Ash's early captures and battles. Gym leader rosters were also slightly altered to match their anime appearances more closely, ensuring consistency between mediums. These adjustments may have been small, but they had an outsized impact on immersion. Children who watched the show could walk into the game world and recognize the same patterns, blurring the line between fiction and gameplay. Unlike later friendship mechanics, this was presented visually, with Pikachu's face changing from cheerful to upset depending on the circumstances. This simple system created a powerful sense of companionship. For the first time, players felt like their Pokémon had emotions that responded to their actions. This emotional feedback loop deepened the bond, turning Pikachu into more than just a sprite on a screen. The design philosophy behind these mechanics reflected the developers' growing awareness of the franchise's broader identity. Red and Blue had been groundbreaking as games, but Yellow recognized that Pokémon was now more than just a cartridge. It was a multimedia phenomenon. By integrating anime elements, adding expressive mechanics, and refining dialogue, Game Freak ensured that Yellow was not only a director's cut, but also a cultural bridge. It acknowledged that many children were first exposed to the franchise through the television show and crafted an experience that tied both mediums together seamlessly. Another telling detail lies in the way NPC trainers were redesigned. Many of their teams included species that appeared in early anime episodes, reinforcing consistency. For instance, gym leaders like Erika were given lineups that more closely resembled their anime battles, ensuring players recognized the connection immediately. Even smaller trainers in routes sometimes carried creatures that matched one-off episodes, a subtle but deliberate design choice. These changes created the impression that the world of the anime and the world of the game existed in tandem, strengthening the illusion that the player was walking through the same story as Ash. The impact of these choices extended into the playground culture of the late 90s. Children debated how closely Yellow matched the anime, whether Jessie and James could be defeated permanently, or whether Pikachu's moods could unlock hidden secrets. These discussions added to the myths and rumors that already surrounded the franchise, ensuring that Yellow had its own place in the collective memory of fans. It was not just a reissue of Red and Blue, but a distinct adventure that carried its own folklore. Another fascinating layer lies in the role of Pikachu's happiness in determining special events. While the mechanic was simple, players discovered that high affection unlocked unique interactions, such as Pikachu dancing or responding positively to items. In some cases, rumors spread that high happiness could unlock evolutions or hidden encounters, even though these features did not exist. The belief itself mattered more than the reality. It demonstrated how small mechanics could inspire boundless imagination, fueling conversations, strategies, and speculation. The emphasis on Pikachu also reshaped competitive strategies for casual players. Because the mascot could not evolve, trainers often had to adapt their teams more carefully than in Red and Blue. Pikachu's limited stats made it a weaker main attacker, but its access to unique moves like Surf gave it niche utility. This limitation created a more personal journey, where success depended on finding balance rather than relying solely on one partner. The decision to limit Pikachu's growth became a powerful lesson in adaptability, teaching players that teamwork mattered more than raw strength. Yellow's tie-ins with the anime also highlighted how franchises evolved to meet cultural needs. At a time when Pokémon dominated television, toys, cards, and movies, releasing a game that aligned with the show ensured cross-media synergy. Children could watch an episode in the morning, play a cartridge that mirrored it in the afternoon, and trade cards with friends at school. This constant reinforcement across mediums made Pokémon an all-encompassing cultural force, and Yellow was the linchpin that tied it all together. Even the Pokédex in Yellow reflected the anime's influence. Descriptions for certain Pokémon were adjusted slightly to align more closely with their animated portrayals. While subtle, these changes reinforced consistency across mediums. Players who read entries in the game found them echoing lines or traits they had already seen on television, deepening the sense that the two worlds were one and the same. Another event worth noting was the way Yellow adjusted available wild Pokémon. Certain creatures were placed in areas that matched Ash's journey, ensuring children encountered the same partners they saw on screen. This design choice subtly encouraged players to recreate Ash's team, leading to countless playground trainers proudly showing off lineups that mirrored the anime. For many fans, this was the first time they consciously role-played as a character within the game, blurring the line between personal journey and scripted story. The presence of Jessie and James also introduced new storytelling techniques to Pokémon. Unlike generic grunts who disappeared after defeat, the duo carried personality and continuity. Players could anticipate their return, creating a sense of episodic rhythm within the game. This narrative structure, borrowed from television, gave the handheld adventure a flow that mirrored the pacing of the anime. Each dungeon encounter felt like an episode of a larger story, culminating in recurring showdowns with familiar faces. Perhaps the most important contribution of these overworld interactions was how they expanded the idea of what Pokémon could be. Red and Blue established the foundation of catching, training, and battling. Yellow added personality, humor, and emotional expression. These additions may have seemed small, but they redefined how players related to their companions and their journey. The result was a game that felt warmer, more character-driven, and more connected to the broader world of Pokémon. By the time Pokémon Yellow was released, the franchise was no longer just a successful video game series. It was a cultural juggernaut. In Japan, the anime was already dominating children's television, and in the West, it had exploded onto Saturday morning schedules and after-school slots. Trading cards, toys, and even school supplies carried the Pokémon logo, making it inescapable. Yellow arrived at the perfect moment to tie everything together. For many children, it was their first step into the world of Pokémon, a bridge that connected the television series they watched daily with the interactive adventure on their handheld console. The game became not only a reimagining of the original journey through Kanto, but also a cultural centerpiece, embodying the multimedia identity of the franchise. Part of Yellow's impact came from its role as one of the last major titles for the Game Boy before the rise of the Game Boy Color. By 1,998 inches Japan and 1,999 inches the West, handheld technology was beginning to move toward brighter screens and expanded palettes. Yellow took advantage of this transition by offering enhanced visuals when played on the newer hardware. Colors popped more vibrantly, making sprites and environments feel fresher than they had in Red and Blue. While not a full-color title designed exclusively for the Game Boy Color, Yellow demonstrated how even modest enhancements could breathe new life into the familiar maps of Kanto. For children who had upgraded to the new system, it was a showcase of what their investment could do. For those still on the original Game Boy, it remained fully accessible, ensuring no one was left behind. The marketing of Yellow reflected the growing ambitions of the franchise. Advertisements emphasized the connection to the anime, highlighting Pikachu's refusal to evolve, the ability to see and interact with it in the overworld, and the presence of Team Rocket's iconic duo. Commercials often showed children comparing the game to the show, blurring the line between the two. The slogan, "Gotta catch 'em all," had already become a cultural touchstone, and Yellow reinforced it by encouraging players to build teams that mirrored Ash's. Many promotional materials even pictured Pikachu perched on Ash's shoulder, reminding audiences that this was the game where the cartoon truly came alive. Culturally, Pokémon Yellow helped cement Pikachu as the face of the entire franchise. While Pikachu was already popular thanks to the anime, Yellow gave fans their first chance to adventure with the mascot as a constant companion. Unlike Red and Blue, where Pikachu was just one of many choices, Yellow made it the default partner, a decision that shaped global perceptions of Pokémon forever. From this point onward, Pikachu was inseparable from the brand, appearing on merchandise, posters, films, and advertisements as the series' undisputed mascot. Without Yellow's emphasis, Pikachu may have remained simply a fan favorite rather than the worldwide icon it became. One of the most fascinating aspects of Yellow's cultural legacy lies in how it influenced remakes and reimaginings. When Fire Red and Leaf Green were released years later On the Game Boy Advance, they drew heavily from the structure of the original Red and Blue, but left traces of yellow in their DNA. Features like Pokémon following the player, which debuted in yellow, were referenced in later remakes and would eventually return in Heart Gold, Soul Silver, and Let's Go Pikachu. These games directly acknowledged Yellow as their spiritual ancestor, leaning on its anime-inspired aesthetic and mechanics. Let's Go Pikachu, in particular, can be seen as a modern retelling of Yellow, taking the bond with Pikachu and placing it into the Switch era. This chain of influence shows how Yellow's innovations continued to ripple through the franchise long after its release. The cultural moment of Yellow was also tied to its release alongside the first Pokémon movie. In many regions, the game arrived just as Mewtwo Strikes Back dominated theaters, creating a 1-2 punch of cultural dominance. Children left theaters clutching exclusive promo cards, then returned home to play a game where Pikachu followed them across Kanto. This synergy between film and game magnified the impact of both, reinforcing Pokémon as an unstoppable phenomenon of the late 90s. Teachers, parents, and media commentators often remarked that Pokémon seemed to be everywhere, and Yellow stood at the center of that ubiquity. Another layer of Yellow's influence can be seen in how it shaped competitive communities, even unintentionally. By restricting the player's starter to Pikachu, it forced trainers to reconsider team building. Many children carried Pikachu through the entire game, regardless of its limited stats, creating teams that reflected emotional bonds as much as strategic thinking. This emphasis on connection over raw strength echoed through later generations, where features like friendship evolutions, affection systems, and bonding mechanics became increasingly central. Yellow laid the groundwork for this cultural shift by showing that the journey was not only about battling, but also about caring for companions. The legacy of Yellow also extends into how players remember the Kanto region. For many who began with Yellow, their mental image of Kanto includes Jesse and James lurking in dungeons, Pikachu scampering behind them, and dialogue lifted from the anime. This means that even though Red and Blue were technically the original versions, Yellow shaped how an entire generation perceived the first region. It demonstrated how memory is not tied only to release order, but also to cultural context. For many, Yellow felt like the definitive Kanto experience, polished and tied to the broader world they loved. Internationally, Yellow's cultural footprint was enormous. In Europe, where Pokémon reached audiences slightly later than in Japan and North America, Yellow often became the entry point for children who missed Red and Blue. Because it was aligned with the anime, it was immediately recognizable, requiring no prior knowledge. For this reason, many European fans consider Yellow their first Pokémon game, even though it technically followed Red and Blue. Its accessibility and charm ensured that it could stand alone, further broadening the franchise's reach. One small but significant detail was the way Yellow leveraged the Game Boy printer, a peripheral that allowed players to print out stickers of their Pokémon. Though rarely used outside of Japan, this feature reflected the developers' awareness that Pokémon had become a multimedia brand extending beyond the screen. Children could take their digital companions into the physical world, sharing them as tangible keepsakes. This blending of digital and physical experiences foreshadowed later innovations like the Pokewalker in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, or the connectivity of Pokémon Go, where the franchise continually sought ways to extend the game into real life. The legacy of Yellow can also be traced in the way later generations treated mascots. After Pikachu's success, each new generation highlighted a signature creature on its box art, ensuring that audiences had an immediate point of connection. From Togepi's marketing presence in Generation 2 to Torchic, Mudkip, and Trico in Generation 3, the emphasis on mascots can be seen as a direct continuation of Yellow's lessons. Pikachu proved that one character could embody the spirit of a generation, and the franchise never looked back. In terms of cultural discourse, Yellow also became a touchstone for debates about canon. Some fans argued that the events of Yellow, with Jessie, James, and Pikachu, represented the true version of the Kanto journey, while others held that Red and Blue remained the baseline canon. This tension reflects the unique position Yellow occupies as both a mainline title and an adaptation. Its hybrid nature blurred the line between game and show, creating a space where multiple interpretations of the same story could coexist. This, too, shaped fan culture, fostering debates and discussions that kept the game alive in memory long after its release. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Yellow's legacy is the way it proved the value of iteration. By reworking an existing game with new features, polished graphics, and cross-media connections, it demonstrated that revisiting old material could feel fresh. This philosophy would carry into later enhanced editions like Crystal, Emerald, and Platinum, each building on the foundation of their predecessors. Yellow was the proof of concept, the experiment that showed how refinement could stand as strongly as innovation. In retrospect, Pokémon Yellow occupies a special place in the franchise's history. It was not the first, nor the most mechanically complex, but it was the game that captured the spirit of Pokémon as a cultural movement. By tying together anime, games, merchandise, and film, it embodied the franchise's ability to be more than the sum of its parts. For millions of players, it was the entry point, the spark that ignited lifelong journeys through regions, generations, and memories. Its influence continues to echo from the design of later games to the enduring image of Pikachu as the face of Pokémon. Behind the bright colors and playful atmosphere of Pokémon, Yellow lay a world of hidden technical quirks and oddities. Like the earlier Red and Blue, Yellow was built on a foundation of code that often pushed the limits of the Game Boy hardware. But because Yellow introduced new features like Pikachu's overworld following, vocal cries, and anime-inspired encounters, its codebase carried its own set of unique glitches and fascinating details. For players who dug beneath the surface, or who stumbled across unusual outcomes by chance, these quirks became part of the game's enduring mystique. Yet in reality, it required complicated programming adjustments. Unlike Red and Blue, which only had to manage the player's sprite and environmental tiles, Yellow constantly tracked Pikachu's position, updating it relative to the player's movements. This extra layer of processing sometimes created odd behavior. For example, if the player moved quickly through certain doorways or across tiles, Pikachu could momentarily vanish before reappearing. These hiccups were not game-breaking, but they revealed how much strain the feature put on the Game Boy's limited memory. This following mechanic also created unusual edge cases. If the player entered areas with complex tile arrangements, Pikachu's sprite could become stuck in odd positions, appearing on top of objects or momentarily clipping through walls. In rare instances, the sprite failed to load at all, leaving Pikachu invisible until the next screen transition. For children who encountered these moments, it sometimes sparked rumors that Pikachu could run away, or that its happiness levels affected its willingness to follow. In truth, it was simply the hardware struggling to keep up with new demands, yet these accidents became part of playground lore, adding another layer of mystery to Yellow's identity. Another technical oddity was the way Pikachu's happiness system was implemented. The game tracked a hidden variable that ranged across a set scale, increasing with healing, victories, or time spent in the party, and decreasing if Pikachu fainted or was stored in the PC. What made this unusual was the way the variable was tied to Pikachu's overworld sprite. Depending on the happiness level, interacting with Pikachu produced different faces and animations. However, the coding for these moods was simplistic, meaning that small fluctuations could cause Pikachu's demeanor to swing dramatically. Players might see Pikachu frown after one faint, then quickly return to cheerful behavior after being healed. This inconsistency sometimes convinced children that more complex systems were at play, such as hidden evolutions or unlockable secrets. In reality, it was simply the result of rough coding, but the illusion it created was far more powerful. Pikachu's unique voice in Yellow also carried technical quirks. Unlike other Pokémon, whose cries were generated through compressed sound channels, Pikachu's Pika voice used digitized audio samples. This required a significant portion of the cartridge's limited memory, leading to compromises elsewhere. For instance, certain sprites and text boxes were compressed more aggressively to make room for the new audio files. This trade-off explains why some sprites in Yellow look slightly different or simplified compared to their red and blue counterparts. While most children never noticed, careful comparisons revealed that small sacrifices had been made in order to bring Pikachu's personality to life. Glitches also gave Yellow its own identity. Many of the infamous bugs from Red and Blue, such as the missing no glitch, were still present but functioned differently due to code adjustments. In Yellow, encountering missing no produced different glitchy sprites, some resembling hybrid forms of existing Pokémon. These distorted creatures fascinated players, sparking rumors of hidden evolutions or unreleased species. Unlike Red and Blue, where missing no could duplicate items like rare candies, Yellow's glitch variants sometimes froze the game entirely, creating a sense of danger around experimentation. Children who braved these glitches often traded wild stories about their encounters, adding to the mythos that Pokémon held endless secrets beyond what the developers intended. One particularly famous glitch in Yellow involved surfing Pikachu. Normally, obtaining the surfing minigame required a special event Pikachu with the move Surf. However, through odd coding interactions, some players discovered that it was possible to trigger the surfing game without the event. By manipulating memory through link cables, or in rare cases through unintended sequences of in-game actions, Pikachu could gain access to the surfing mechanic. This became one of the most enduring legends of Yellow, that surfing Pikachu could be unlocked by treating Pikachu well, maxing out its happiness, or performing obscure rituals. Though the true method required external distributions or glitches, the belief itself spread widely, proving how much children loved the idea of hidden rewards tied to companionship. Sprite changes also highlighted the technical quirks of Yellow. Many Pokémon received redesigned sprites to better match their anime appearances, but the compression required to fit them into the cartridge sometimes led to odd distortions. For example, certain creatures appeared with thicker outlines or slightly warped proportions compared to earlier games. While these changes were largely artistic, they were also shaped by memory management. Developers had to balance the desire for accurate representations with the constraints of storage, leading to compromises that gave Yellow's sprites a distinctive look. The inclusion of Jesse and James introduced another layer of coding oddities. Their battles used slightly different scripts from standard grunt encounters, with custom dialogue and unique team compositions. Because of this, their fights occasionally triggered unusual behaviors if interrupted by glitches or external manipulation. In some cases, defeating them in unexpected ways, such as through glitch-induced status effects, could cause the game to display garbled text or loop battle animations. While rare, these moments fueled rumors that Jesse and James could be permanently removed from the game or replaced with hidden characters. In truth, it was simply the result of their events being hard-coded in a less flexible way than standard encounters. Another fascinating technical quirk involved the Pokédex. Because Yellow reused much of Red and Blue's base code, but added new sprite designs and text, some entries displayed minor differences in wording or formatting. These small variations sometimes led to confusion about whether Yellow was introducing entirely new lore. For instance, slightly altered descriptions of certain species made it seem as though their behavior had changed compared to Red and Blue. In reality, these differences were artifacts of localization and memory management, but they helped reinforce the sense that Yellow was its own distinct version of Kanto. The map adjustments in Yellow also produced quirks. Because certain areas were altered to reflect anime-inspired events, the underlying tile data sometimes clashed with existing collision coding. This occasionally led to odd scenarios where players could walk onto tiles they were not supposed to, or where Pikachu's sprite would misalign with the environment. These small inconsistencies rarely broke the game but gave it a unique texture compared to its predecessors. For players who explored thoroughly, discovering a spot where Pikachu seemed to stand on top of a wall or hover in midair became an amusing novelty. Link cable functionality in Yellow also carried technical quirks. Trading and battling worked much the same as in Red and Blue, but Pikachu's special status created complications. If traded to another game, Pikachu would lose its overworld following feature and revert to an ordinary Pokémon. This sometimes confused players who expected Pikachu's unique behavior to carry over. Furthermore, certain glitches involving link trades could produce unexpected results, such as corrupted movesets or altered sprites. These accidents highlighted how delicate the balance was between new features and the old code they were built upon. Another odd detail lies in how item storage was handled. Like earlier games, Yellow had strict limits on how many items could be carried or stored in the PC. However, because of new text and sprite data, memory was tighter than ever, leading to occasional graphical flickers or truncated text when item lists grew long. For most players, this was invisible, but for those who pushed the limits, such as hoarding TMs or experimenting with glitches, the strain on memory became obvious. This quirk reinforced the sense that Pokémon was a world bursting at the seams with content, straining against the constraints of its tiny cartridge. In the end, these technical quirks and glitches added to Yellow's charm. They reminded players that the world of Pokémon was not a perfectly polished machine, but a fragile creation held together by clever programming tricks. The imperfections gave the game character, creating stories and legends that spread across playgrounds and forums. From Pikachu disappearing through walls to strange encounters with glitch Pokémon, Yellow's oddities became as much a part of its identity as its anime-inspired features. What makes these quirks so fascinating in hindsight is how they highlight the developer's ingenuity. Working within extreme limitations, they managed to add new mechanics, sprites, and audio without breaking the fragile balance of the game. While some bugs slipped through, they were often embraced by players as secrets to be uncovered. In this way, the quirks of Yellow contributed to its lasting legacy, ensuring that it was remembered not only as a polished retelling of Kanto, but also as a playground of mysteries. As the main adventure of Pokémon Yellow drew to a close, many players discovered that the experience did not truly end with the defeat of the Elite Four. Just like in Red and Blue, the region of Kanto still had layers of secrets and curiosities waiting to be uncovered. What set Yellow apart, however, was the way these post-game quirks were infused with the same anime-inspired flavor that defined the rest of the journey. From the lingering presence of Team Rocket to Pikachu's unwavering companionship, the endgame of Yellow carried a personality all its own. One of the most immediate post-game differences lay in the rival battle at Indigo Plateau. In Yellow, the rivals' team had been altered throughout the journey to reflect changes from the anime, and the final battle maintained this philosophy. Instead of simply mirroring the rosters from Red and Blue, the rivals' championship lineup was adjusted to include creatures that matched his thematic role more closely. This created a sense of finality that felt consistent with the rest of Yellow's tweaks, reminding players that even familiar moments had been reimagined. The presence of Pikachu continued to shape the post-game. While other games in the first generation left the player's starter as just another member of the party, Yellow maintained Pikachu as a unique companion. Its moods, tracked through the affection system, still responded to the player's actions after the credits rolled. This meant that the emotional bond did not end with the narrative climax. Children could continue to nurture Pikachu, checking on its happiness and imagining that the friendship they had built was ongoing. For many, this deepened the sense that Pokémon was not just a game to be beaten, but a world to be lived in. Another fascinating post-game detail lies in the Cerulean Cave, where Mewtwo waited as the ultimate test. While the encounter was similar to Red and Blue, players carried with them a very different emotional context. Having traveled with Pikachu, faced Jessie and James, and lived through a story shaped by the anime, confronting Mewtwo felt less like a hidden boss and more like the climax of a larger mythos. Children who had seen Mewtwo Strikes Back in theaters often connected the dots, imagining that the game's battle represented the same legendary conflict they had watched on screen. This merging of film and game transformed the Cerulean Cave into more than just a high-level dungeon. It became an extension of the Pokémon narrative across mediums. Rumors and playground myths flourished in Yellow's post-game. Children whispered that Pikachu's happiness could unlock hidden evolutions, or that defeating Jessie and James a certain number of times would remove them from the game permanently. Others believed that surfing Pikachu had hidden storylines, or that high affection could summon rare encounters in specific areas. None of these secrets existed in the code, but the fact that so many believed them highlights how Yellow blurred the line between imagination and reality. The game encouraged speculation simply by existing as a remix of the familiar. If Jessie and James could appear where they never had before, who was to say what other surprises lay hidden? Another lingering quirk of Yellow was its use of wild Pokémon distribution. Certain areas were tweaked so that species matched the anime more closely, meaning that players might encounter creatures late into the post-game that they had not seen in earlier playthroughs of Red and Blue. This encouraged exploration even after completing the main quest. The thrill of finding slight changes in encounter tables reinforced the idea that Yellow was not a simple reissue, but a living variation on the original world. The post-game also highlighted the symbolic role of Pikachu's refusal to evolve. Many children, upon completing the adventure, attempted once again to use a Thunderstone, only to be met with the same refusal. This design choice served as a final reminder that Yellow was a story about individuality and loyalty, not about maximizing strength. It taught players that victory was possible without always choosing the most powerful option, an important message that resonated beyond the game. The refusal mechanic became one of Yellow's most defining features, remembered long after other mechanical tweaks had faded. One fascinating aspect of Yellow's legacy is how it shaped future expectations of post-game content. By refining and reimagining existing elements of Kanto, Yellow suggested that games could remain fresh through small but meaningful changes. This philosophy would echo in later enhanced versions like Crystal, Emerald, and Platinum, each of which built upon the base game with added features, new story beats, or improved presentation. Yellow set the precedent for this tradition, proving that audiences welcomed iterative reimaginings as long as they carried enough personality to feel distinct. Yellow's long-term impact also rests in how it shaped the franchise's relationship with the anime. For years, fans debated whether Yellow's story was canon to the games or simply a playful adaptation of the show. This blurred line influenced how later generations were received. When games like Black and White leaned into deeper narrative themes, or when spin-offs like the Mystery Dungeon series experimented with personality-driven stories, they carried forward lessons first tested in Yellow. The game demonstrated that Pokémon could succeed not only as a system of battles and captures, but also as a narrative experience tied to characters, emotions, and themes. Another layer of Yellow's post-game quirks was the way it influenced competitive memory. Even though Pikachu was underpowered compared to other creatures, the affection children carried for it often kept it in their lineups long past the point of practicality. For many, this created teams that were less about efficiency and more about personal identity. Players walked into the final battles of the game with rosters that reflected not only strategic decisions, but also the bonds they had formed. This trend foreshadowed the ways later games would encourage individuality through features like contests, secret bases, and customization options. Yellow was an early expression of the idea that who you traveled with mattered as much as how strong they were. The long-term cultural memory of Yellow also includes its role in solidifying Pikachu as the global mascot of Pokémon. While the anime had already positioned Pikachu as the face of the franchise, Yellow ensured that every player experienced a journey with it as their partner. From this point on, Pikachu was no longer just one option among many. It was the character that embodied Pokémon itself. This cultural positioning had profound effects, influencing merchandise, marketing, and even design decisions in later games. Without Yellow, Pikachu might never have become as inseparable from the brand as it is today. Even decades later, Yellow remains a touchstone for fans. Players look back on it as the definitive way to experience Kanto, the version that carried the most personality and emotional weight. While Red and Blue established the foundation, Yellow infused that foundation with warmth, humor, and multimedia connections. It showed that small changes could transform a familiar world into something vibrant and new. Its legacy lives on not only in later remakes, but also in the collective nostalgia of a generation that grew up with Pikachu trotting loyally behind them. In many ways, the post-game of Yellow is less about what it adds mechanically and more about what it represents symbolically. It stands as a reminder that games are not only systems, but also cultural artifacts shaped by the media landscape around them. Yellow captured a moment when Pokemon was more than a fad. It was a global phenomenon, weaving together anime, film, trading cards, and toys into one unstoppable force. By embodying that moment, Yellow secured its place as more than a simple director's cut. It became a cultural icon in its own right, remembered not just for its mechanics, but for the feelings it inspired.